Today we're going to talk about Alzheimer's disease. The brain itself actually produces insulin and has its own contained blood sugar management pathway. So now, instead of the brain cell saying, hey dude, we need sugar, the brain cells are saying, hey, there's too much sugar coming in, stop, you're flooding me, you're swelling. The brain is a closed box, it's a fixed space. So even a tiny amount of change in volume affects the brain pressure tremendously. Your choice. Your choice. Cells are continuously swelling and being damaged internally by carbohydrates. It doesn't do that. The adult brain, if you lose those brain cells, they're gone. If you lose those brain cells, they're gone. They're gone. They're gone. Brains get smaller, the volume of the brain cells go away, and that ultimately is Alzheimer's disease. Yes, we can probably prevent or reduce the likelihood of severe Alzheimer's, but once it's happened, you can't fix it. You can't fix it. Don't change your eating pattern. Don't change your diet when you're 70 years old and you already got Alzheimer's. Change it in your 20s and your 30s and your 40s to prevent the likelihood of the disease happening. It's a devastating disease. Alzheimer's is called type 3 diabetes, onset of Alzheimer's, but ultimately is irreversible. Your choice. Alzheimer's disease has a variety of different causes, but by far the most common one is... Hi folks, this is Dr. Rob Sivers, and today, again, I'm going to wade into a controversial topic. Again, a lot of the topics that I speak about are not necessarily my primary wheelhouse. It's stuff that I've thought a lot about. So I'm sharing, not as an expert, but as someone opining, as someone thinking about a disease. And today we're going to talk about Alzheimer's disease. Gray matter death, progressive neuronal gray matter loss in older age. Alzheimer's disease is caused, as far as we know, by chronic inflammation of the brain itself and certainly of the blood vessels that supply the brain. And the causes are multifactorial because the causes of inflammation and vasculitis, or inflammation of the blood vessels, has a variety of different causes. We know one of the common causes is infection. And especially if those of you remember the old slow-growing viruses that occurred, mad cow disease, for example, was one of them. We had these Jakob-Creutzfeldt diseases, which were viruses that slowly caused damage in the brain. Infection and a variety of other possibly bacterial origins may cause progressive gray matter loss, death of those brain cells. Radiation can cause that. Nicotine and carbohydrates and other toxins specifically cause Alzheimer's disease. Now, it's an interesting part about carbohydrates causing Alzheimer's disease, because they cause Alzheimer's disease, as far as we're aware, on a multiple different levels. Number one, they affect the blood vessels, the arterial blood vessels and the micro blood vessels, the endothelial cells, the cells that line blood vessels to the brain, causing swelling, causing a decrease in oxygenation and nutrient production or nutrient supply to the brain as a whole, but particularly the gray matter, which has a very high requirement for oxygen and for nutrients, particularly in a thinking awake person. So as those blood vessels stiffen, as their walls get narrowed by the swelling of the endothelial cells based on high carbohydrates that are attached to water that swell those cells, you're getting less oxygen and less nutrients going to those brain cells, and slowly over time their performance, their ability to function gets decreased, and you get this chronic damage. And then they become vulnerable if damage does happen, and cells are being damaged all the time. If damage does occur, the rate of repair goes down. So certainly sugar affects the vasculitis, and we know that sugar is the commonest cause of vasculitis, in vascular inflammation in the modern era, certainly in this country where we're on a standard American diet. The second aspect, which is very interesting, is that the brain is somewhat of a protected space. There's the blood-brain barrier, which is this barrier that nutrients and oxygen have to get across into the brain. The brain is a very protected organ. And what's interesting, and I don't know that much about it, but I can speculate a little bit, is that the brain itself actually produces insulin and has its own contained blood sugar management pathway. Sugar is important for certain cells, the Schwann cells that line the white matter. That's a whole different discussion, because Alzheimer's is primarily an interface, a white matter, gray matter, but primarily a gray matter disease. But there are certain cells in the brain that require sugar, and under high functioning conditions, like hitting nitrous in a race car, the brain sometimes does benefit from sugar. But there's enough sugar being produced by the liver that there should be enough. However, if your brain is exposed to massive amounts of sugar all the time, if it is indeed has what is now speculated to be an internal insulin sugar control of supply of sugar to the intracellular environment. Remember, what insulin does is it allows sugar to enter the brain cell. So when there's a demand by the brain cell for sugar, and it's a demand-driven thing, then insulin gets released and sugar enters the brain cell through those insulin gates, through those insulin channels. However, that is under a demand-based system. The problem with the standard American diet is it's a supply-based system. There's this massive amount of sugar. So now, instead of the brain cell saying, hey, dude, we need sugar, the brain cells are saying, hey, there's too much sugar coming in. Stop, stop, stop. You're flooding me. You're swelling me. And the brain is a closed box. It's a fixed space. So even a tiny amount of change in volume affects the brain pressure tremendously. Think about a concussion. Think about traumatic brain injury, where the brain gets swollen by edema, by swelling, and you lose consciousness and you get brain damage. Well, those little micro hits are happening because now we're being supplied by all the sugar. And remember, every molecule of sugar is attached to a molecule of water. So those brain cells are continuously swelling and being damaged internally by carbohydrates. And the carbohydrates take water with it, and the body doesn't have an effective water elimination system, particularly in the closed box that is the brain. Very sensitive to volume changes. So now, instead of the brain cells being in charge of demanding, they're trying to protect themselves from this excess sugar. And that is damaging the brain cells, damaging them by swelling them and by slowing down the rate at which the organelles can function properly intracellular. And that damage accumulates over time. Now these brain cells are getting damaged all the time. And remember, brain cells, as far as we are aware in humans, do not get replaced. In other words, if you lose one, I can chop out 70% of your liver. And within about 3 months, that liver has regenerated itself completely. Think about your skin. You cut yourself, the skin cells regenerate. Within a week or two, that cut is gone. The brain doesn't do that. Brain doesn't do that. The adult brain, if you lose those brain cells, if you lose that gray matter, those neurons, they're gone. They're gone. Now, every brain cell has this membrane, and the membrane is made up about 30% of cholesterol. Yeah, cholesterol. Cholesterol is an integral part of the cellular membrane, but it's got proteins in there, and it's got phospholipids, or these fatty chains. And the fatty chains are preferentially fairly inert for the most part. In other words, they're all single bonded carbon molecules called saturated fat. And then there are specific types of fat called essential fatty acids. And the essential fatty acids are actually polyunsaturated fatty acids called 3 and 6 omega fatty acids that we have to eat. We can't produce them inside the human body. And they all go to proper membrane function, not just of the outer cell membrane, but also the mitochondrial membrane. All the organelles have these lipid layers that are the structural walls or structural membranes of these organelles. And the makeup of that is so important, because if you have a lot of double bonds, those double bonds are unstable in the polyunsaturated fatty acids, and when they break, they release oxygen-free radicals, they release reactive species that then create intracellular inflammation and damage those cells. And if you do not have an adequate supply of healthy fat, especially essential fatty acids and saturated fat, to repair and replenish those brain cells, guess what? They die. And what then happens is you get that space has to be filled up, and you get the replacement of active, healthy brain cells with this amorphous gelatinous mess called amyloid. Amyloid is a type of protein, and it's not the amyloid production that I don't think is causing the damage. The amyloid is just space filling. It's just there to fill the space where the brain cells are dying as a support structure. But the brains get smaller, the volume of the brain cells go away, and that ultimately is Alzheimer's disease. Alzheimer's disease has a variety of different causes, but by far the most common one is the twofold of chronic excessive carbohydrate consumption, number one, and a reduction in essential fatty acid and saturated fat consumption. So the saturated fat helps brain cells repair damage, and injurious agents, carbohydrates in particular, plus certain infections, in a setting of deficient repair material, repair tools, repair products, leads to permanent damage. So yes, we can probably prevent or reduce the likelihood of severe Alzheimer's, but once it's happened, you can't fix it. Don't change your eating pattern. Don't change your diet when you're 70 years old and you already got Alzheimer's. Change it in your 20s and your 30s and your 40s to prevent the likelihood of the disease happening. Is it reversible early on? Yes, it is. But late, once it's clinically significant, it is extremely unlikely. Prevention happens early. Prevention happens when you're least likely to think of prevention. What teenager is thinking about Alzheimer's unless they've got a parent with Alzheimer's? It's a devastating disease. But as parents, we can start talking to our kids, and better still, we can change the home environment for those kids. Alzheimer's is called type 3 diabetes. It's a sugar problem. Chronic excessive carbohydrate consumption, insulin resistance, particularly within the brain, and a lack of repair mechanisms of saturated fat and of essential fats, 3 and 6 omega fatty acids, is this wonderful mix that contributes to unabated inflammation in these brain cells, that knocks them off progressively and causes more and more serious, more and more profound, earlier and earlier onset of Alzheimer's that ultimately is irreversible. Prevention, by becoming fat adapted on a high fat, low carbohydrate diet, is the single best thing you can do. And if you have a parent who suffered from Alzheimer's, you're probably going to, unless you understand and address what you're able to address. Can't address everything, but what you're able to address. Your choice. I fear losing my brain more than I fear cancer.